Under the glaring moonlight, Elena's blood froze as she witnessed the massive bobcat gently carrying Cole away by the scruff, not as prey, but with the tender care of a mother rescuing her own child. The terrible truth dawned on her with heart-stopping clarity. This wasn't a kidnapping for food, but something far more extraordinary that would shatter everything scientists thought they knew about predator behavior. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The small black kitten trembled in the shadows of the barn, its emerald eyes wide with terror as the massive shape loomed above. Moonlight spilled through the cracks in the weathered wood, illuminating the spotted fur and muscular frame of the predator that had tracked it there. A bobcat. Wild, powerful, and seemingly intent on making the tiny house cat its next meal. The kitten pressed itself against the rough wooden wall, nowhere left to run, its midnight fur standing on end as it faced what seemed to be certain death. But in that moment of frozen terror, something unexpected happened. The bobcat didn't pounce. Instead, it lowered its muzzle and gently gripped the kitten by the scruff, lifting it as a mother would lift her own young. What happened next would challenge everything wildlife experts thought they knew about these elusive predators and ignite a controversy that would divide an entire community. Was this a bizarre case of cross-species adoption, or something far more sinister? The truth behind this extraordinary encounter would prove more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with this incredible story, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss our newest wildlife mysteries and animal encounters. Now let's return to the astonishing case of the black kitten and the bobcat that changed everything. The small town of Pine Ridge, nestled against the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. At just over 4,000 residents, it was large enough to have its own small veterinary clinic, but small enough that Dr. Elena Ramirez knew most of her patients and their owners by name. At 36, Elena had built a reputation as not just an excellent veterinarian, but as someone with an almost supernatural connection to animals. Local legend claimed she could calm the most aggressive dog with just a whisper or coax a terrified cat from its hiding place with nothing more than a gentle look. On this particular morning in late September, Elena was running late. Her ancient Toyota pickup sputtered and protested as she urged it up the winding gravel road toward the Jenkins farm. Martha Jenkins had called at dawn, her voice tight with worry about a litter of kittens born in her barn 3 weeks earlier. "Something's taken one of them, Dr. Ramirez," Martha had said, her voice cracking. "The little black one. He was there last night when I put out food, but this morning he's gone. And there are tracks, big cat tracks." Elena had promised to come right away, though predation was a natural, if unfortunate, part of rural life. Domestic cats, especially kittens, were easy prey for the coyotes, foxes, and occasionally bobcats that roamed the surrounding wilderness. Usually there was little to be done besides offering sympathy and advice on protecting the remaining animals. As Elena pulled into the Jenkins farmyard, she spotted Martha standing by the weathered red barn, arms wrapped tightly around herself despite the mild autumn morning. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face lined with the evidence of decades spent working outdoors. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Martha said as Elena approached, equipment bag in hand. "I know it might seem silly to call you about a missing kitten, but—" "It's never silly to care about an animal, Martha," Elena assured her, following the older woman into the dim interior of the barn. The familiar sense of hay, dust, and livestock enveloped them. In a corner near some stacked hay bales, a cardboard box lined with old towels contained 4 tiny kittens, 2 orange tabbies, 1 calico, and 1 gray, all nursing from a thin tortoiseshell cat who watched the humans with cautious yellow eyes. Molly showed up pregnant about 2 months ago, Martha explained. Started hanging around the barn and I couldn't turn her away. She had 5 kittens, these 4 and a little black one. Cole, I called him. He was the smallest but the most adventurous. Elena knelt to examine the mother cat and remaining kittens, finding them healthy if somewhat undernourished. "And you said you found tracks?" she asked, straightening up. Martha nodded grimly and led Elena to the barn's back entrance. Just outside, in a patch of soft earth, were unmistakable prints. Too large for a house cat, too small for a cougar, with the distinctive rounded shape and lack of claw marks that characterized feline rather than canine tracks. "Bobcat," Elena confirmed, crouching to examine them more closely. "Adult, probably female based on the size." She traced the air above one perfect print, noting the direction. "Looks like it came in from the woods to the north." What she didn't say was that the tracks told an unusual story. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no tufts of fur. The bobcat had apparently entered the barn, taken the kitten, and left, all without disturbing the mother cat or other kittens enough to create a commotion that would have woken Martha in the farmhouse less than 50 yards away. "Poor little thing," Martha sighed, blinking rapidly. "I should have brought them into the house. But Molly seemed so comfortable here, and my husband's allergies." "You couldn't have known," Elena assured her, though something about the scene was nagging at her professional instincts. Predators typically killed and consumed their prey on the spot, especially something as small as a kitten. Taking it away intact was unusual behavior. Elena followed the tracks to the edge of the property where they disappeared into the dense undergrowth of the forest. She was about to turn back when a flash of movement caught her eye, just a brief glimpse of tawny spotted fur moving between trees about 30 yards into the woods. "I think our bobcat is still around," she said quietly to Martha, who had followed her. "Would you mind if I set up a trail camera? Just to see what's happening. There's something not quite typical about this situation." Martha agreed readily, and Elena returned to her truck for the compact wildlife camera she kept for monitoring injured animals she'd released back into the wild. Within 20 minutes, she had it secured to a tree with a good view of the game trail the bobcat had apparently used. "I'll come back and check it in a few days," she promised Martha. "In the meantime, you might want to keep Molly and the other kittens inside if possible." As Elena drove back to town, her mind kept returning to the odd details of the scene. In 15 years of veterinary practice in rural areas, she'd seen plenty of predation cases, but this one didn't fit the pattern. The bobcat's behavior seemed deliberate, almost careful. Back at her small clinic on Pine Ridge's main street, Elena finished her afternoon appointments distracted by thoughts of the missing kitten and the bobcat's unusual behavior. After her last patient, a chocolate lab with an ear infection, she found herself pulling out her old wildlife biology textbooks from veterinary school, refreshing her knowledge of bobcat behavior. 3 days later, Elena returned to the Jenkins farm to check the trail camera. Martha met her with unexpected news. "Another one's gone," she said, her voice hollow. "The little gray one disappeared last night. I brought the others into the house after that, despite my husband sneezing." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. One kitten might be explained as opportunistic predation, but 2 suggested something more targeted. With growing concern, she retrieved the memory card from the trail camera and pulled up the images on her tablet right there at the forest's edge. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The camera had captured several clear images of a female bobcat, distinctive with a notched ear and unusual markings on her face, moving along the trail. And in 2 of the nighttime photos, taken just hours after Elena had installed the camera, the bobcat was clearly carrying the small black kitten, not in her jaws as prey, but gently by the scruff, the way a mother cat carries her young. Most shocking of all, the kitten appeared to be alive. its tiny body relaxed in the instinctive posture of a carried kitten rather than the limp form of a kill. "Martha," Elena said slowly, "I need to show you something, but I'm not sure you'll believe it." Martha stared at the images on Elena's tablet, her weathered fingers trembling slightly as she swiped through them one by one. The evidence was undeniable. The bobcat wasn't killing the kittens, it was taking them somewhere. "This doesn't make any sense," Martha whispered. "Why would a wild predator be collecting kittens?" Elena shook her head, her professional curiosity now fully engaged. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." That evening, after calling the local wildlife conservation officer for the necessary permissions, Elena prepared for what might be an all-night tracking expedition. She packed her veterinary kit, a tranquilizer gun for emergencies only, water, trail rations, and camping gear. The conservation officer, Mark Hendricks, had been skeptical of her theory, but intrigued enough by the photos to grant her a temporary research permit. "Just don't interfere unless there's immediate danger to the domestic animals," he'd warned, "and call me the moment you find anything significant." As twilight descended over the mountains, Elena positioned herself in a small blind she'd constructed at the edge of the Jenkins property. The remaining 3 kittens were safely inside the farmhouse now, but Elena had convinced Martha to place a small carrier containing one of the kittens' blankets near the barn. The familiar scent might attract the bobcat again, giving Elena a chance to follow her. Hours passed with nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night, the distant hooting of owls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Elena was beginning to think the bobcat wouldn't return when a movement at the edge of the clearing caught her eye. The bobcat emerged from the shadows like a ghost, her movements fluid and silent. In the moonlight, Elena could see the distinctive notched ear clearly. The wildcat paused, nose raised to test the air, then moved purposefully toward the carrier with the blanket. She sniffed it thoroughly, then let out a soft sound, not quite a meow, not quite a chirp, that Elena had never heard from a bobcat before. When the bobcat headed back toward the forest, Elena waited until she was 30 yards ahead before following. Tracking a predator designed by evolution for stealth through a nighttime forest would be nearly impossible, but Elena had prepared for this. The tiny GPS tag she'd hidden in the blanket would lead her straight to the bobcat's destination. For nearly 2 miles, Elena followed the signal through increasingly rough terrain, climbing higher into the foothills. The forest grew denser, the underbrush more tangled, until finally the GPS showed the bobcat had stopped moving about a quarter-mile ahead. Elena slowed her pace, moving with deliberate care to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The signal led to a rock outcropping surrounded by dense brush and fallen logs, natural protection that would deter larger predators. Elena crouched behind a tree, using her night vision binoculars to scan the area. At first she saw nothing, but then a movement near the base of the rocks caught her attention. The female bobcat emerged from what appeared to be a small cave or den in the rocks. But it was what happened next that left Elena frozen in disbelief. From the den entrance came the unmistakable shapes of kittens, not just the 2 missing from Martha's barn, but what looked like 3 or 4 small bobcat kittens as well. The black kitten, Cole, who had been the first to disappear, moved with apparent comfort among his wild cousins, playing and tumbling with them while the mother bobcat looked on. Elena's mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing. Was this bobcat actually integrating domestic kittens into her own litter? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right before her eyes. She carefully extracted her camera from her pack and began documenting the extraordinary scene, her hands shaking slightly with excitement and disbelief. The bobcat kittens appeared to be about 8 to 10 weeks old, young enough to still be dependent on their mother, but old enough to play and explore. The two domestic kittens seemed to have been accepted into this wild family unit, playing alongside their bobcat counterparts, groomed by the mother bobcat and apparently living in the den. Elena watched for nearly an hour, fascinated by the interactions. The mother bobcat was attentive and protective of all the kittens, making no distinction between her biological offspring and the domestic additions to her family. When she called them back to the den with that same unique vocalization Elena had heard earlier, all the kittens, wild and domestic, responded equally. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Elena had filled her camera's memory card and had barely touched her supplies, too engrossed in the unprecedented behavior she was witnessing. She knew she needed to report what she'd found, but she was reluctant to leave. This was the kind of discovery that comes once in a lifetime, if ever. Finally, as the forest began to stir with morning activity, Elena quietly retreated. The bobcat family had returned to their den, and she didn't want to risk disturbing them or having the mother become aware of her presence. As she hiked back toward the Jenkins farm, her mind was already composing the report she would need to write, and wondering how the scientific community would respond to such an extraordinary case of cross-species adoption. Martha was waiting anxiously when Elena emerged from the forest, her face lined with concern and lack of sleep. "Did you find anything? Are they alive?" Elena nodded, still processing what she had witnessed. "They're alive, Martha. And they're being cared for." Inside the farmhouse kitchen, Elena showed Martha the photos and videos she'd taken, explaining her observations as gently as possible. "So this wild animal is raising our kittens alongside her own?" Martha said slowly, her expression caught between relief and bewilderment. "It appears so," Elena confirmed. "I've never seen or heard of anything like this before. Bobcats are solitary predators. They sometimes kill domestic cats they see as competition or prey. This kind of adoption behavior is unprecedented." "But why?" Martha asked, the question Elena had been asking herself all night. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "My best guess is that she lost some of her litter, disease, predation, accident, and somehow the maternal instinct to care for a specific number of young overrode her predatory instincts when she encountered your kittens." Martha was quiet for a long moment, looking at the images of the black and gray kittens playing with their wild foster siblings. "What happens now?" It was the question Elena had been dreading. As a veterinarian and wildlife enthusiast, she knew this was an incredible opportunity to observe a completely undocumented behavior. As a professional with ethical obligations, she knew there were more complicated considerations. "I need to report this to the wildlife authorities," she said carefully. "This is significant from a scientific perspective, but I also understand these are your kittens, and you have every right to want them back." Martha's eyes remained on the photo of Cole, tumbling with a spotted bobcat kitten, his black fur a stark contrast to the tawny markings of his wild playmate. "They look happy," she said finally. "Safer than they were in my barn, maybe." Before Elena could respond, her phone rang. Mark Hendricks, the conservation officer, returning her earlier call. As she answered and began to explain what she'd discovered, she saw Martha still staring at the photos, a mix of emotions playing across her face. What had begun as a simple case of missing kittens was rapidly becoming something much more complex, a situation that would soon draw the attention of wildlife experts, ethicists, and media from across the country, all converging on the small town of Pine Ridge to witness the extraordinary case of the bobcat, who kidnapped kittens not to harm them, but to raise them as her own. Within 48 hours, Elena's discovery had transformed the quiet routine of Pine Ridge. Mark Hendricks had contacted his superiors at the State Wildlife Department, who had immediately dispatched a team of biologists to verify and document the unprecedented behavior. Word had somehow leaked to local media, and by the second day, 3 news vans had parked along the main street, their satellite dishes raised like curious periscopes exploring this rural outpost. "I've never seen anything like it," admitted Dr. Patricia Lawson, the lead wildlife biologist sent by the state. She was a tall woman with prematurely silver hair and the weathered face of someone who spent more time outdoors than in. Cross-species adoption occasionally happens in captivity, but in the wild, between a predator and what would normally be prey, it defies everything we know about bobcat behavior. They were seated around Martha Jenkins's kitchen table. Elena, Dr. Lawson, Mark Hendricks, and 2 other members of the wildlife team. On the table between them sat Elena's laptop displaying the photos and videos she had taken at the den site. "Could the domestic kittens be related to the bobcat somehow?" asked Mark. "Maybe the mother cat mated with a bobcat?" Dr. Lawson shook her head. "Hybridization between bobcats and domestic cats is extremely rare, nearly impossible under natural conditions. Besides, these kittens clearly look like normal domestic cats." She pointed to an image of Cole playing with his bobcat foster siblings. "No, this is genuine adoption behavior. The question is why. And what we should do about it," added Mark, glancing at Martha, who had remained largely silent during the discussion. That question had been weighing on Elena since her discovery. As a veterinarian, she understood the complex ethical considerations at play. These were domestic animals, technically Martha's property, being raised by a wild predator. Yet the kittens appeared healthy and well cared for, integrated into a family unit that was providing everything they needed. "There are several considerations here," Dr. Lawson said carefully. "On one hand, we have an unprecedented opportunity to observe a completely undocumented behavior in a wild bobcat. The scientific value is enormous. On the other hand, we have concerns about the welfare of both the domestic kittens and the wild bobcats." "What kind of concerns?" Martha asked, speaking up for the first time. "The domestic kittens aren't equipped for life in the wild long term," Dr. Lawson explained. "They lack the instincts and physical adaptations that would allow them to survive independently. And there's concern about the bobcat kittens possibly adopting behaviors from their domestic companions that might disadvantage them in the wild." Elena had been considering these issues as well, but she had also observed something remarkable at the den site. "The domestic kittens are already learning from their bobcat siblings," she pointed out. "I saw Cole stalking and pouncing with the same technique as the bobcat kittens, and the mother appears to be teaching all of them equally." Mark leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "There's also the legal aspect. Bobcats are protected wildlife. We can't just let domestic cats integrate into the wild population without considering the ecological implications." By that evening, news of the unusual adoption had spread beyond local media. National outlets had picked up the story, dubbing it the Bobcat Kidnapper or the Miracle of Pine Ridge. Online debates raged between those who saw it as a heartwarming story of cross-species compassion and those who insisted the kitten should be rescued and returned to domestic life. The residents of Pine Ridge found themselves divided as well. At the town's only diner, heated discussions broke out over coffee and pie. "It ain't natural," insisted Harold Thompson, a local rancher. "Wild animals should stay wild, pets should stay pets. Next thing you know, that bobcat will be teaching those kittens to hunt livestock." "Oh, for heaven's sake, Harold," countered Maggie Chen, who owned the local bookstore. "It's a miracle is what it is. Nature showing us that compassion crosses all boundaries. Those kittens would have died in the wild on their own, but instead this mother took them in. We should be learning from her, not interfering." Elena found herself caught in the middle of these debates, both professionally and personally. As a veterinarian, she had responsibilities toward both domestic and wild animals. As a scientist at heart, she recognized the incredible research opportunity. And as someone who had witnessed the Bobcat family firsthand, she couldn't deny the obvious care and protection the mother was providing to all her kittens, regardless of species. 3 days after the initial discovery, Elena accompanied Dr. Lawson and her team to observe the den site again. They set up a more sophisticated blind about 50 yards from the den, equipped with high-resolution cameras and recording equipment. "We'll maintain this observation post for at least 2 weeks," Dr. Lawson explained as they settled in. "Minimal interference, just documentation. The state has classified this as a priority research opportunity." Elena nodded, relieved that immediate intervention wasn't planned. She had worried that wildlife officials might decide to remove the domestic kittens from the den, disrupting the extraordinary family unit that had formed. As the afternoon sun filtered through the pine canopy, the mother bobcat emerged from the den, followed by her mixed litter. Elena counted 3 bobcat kittens and the 2 domestic kittens, Cole, the black one, and Ash, the gray one from Martha's barn. All 5 youngsters appeared healthy, their fur glossy, their movements energetic as they played and explored under their mother's watchful eye. "Look at that, Doctor," Lawson whispered, pointing as the mother bobcat demonstrated a hunting crouch, her body low to the ground, shoulders slightly raised. All 5 kittens, domestic and wild, watched intently before mimicking the posture with varying degrees of success. "She's teaching all of them the same survival skills." For nearly 3 hours, they observed the family. The domestic kittens seemed fully integrated, responding to the mother's vocalizations, playing with their wild siblings, even participating in what appeared to be rudimentary hunting exercises involving a small rodent the mother had caught and brought back to the den area. "It's remarkable," Dr. Lawson admitted, as they finally packed up for the evening. "In any other circumstance, those domestic kittens would be prey, not family. Something very unusual is happening here." As they hiked back toward Martha's farm, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Mark. "Town meeting called for tomorrow night. County officials want to discuss the bobcat situation. Media will be there. You should come." Elena sighed, knowing that the peaceful observation phase might be coming to an end. Once public opinion and politics became involved, the delicate balance they'd maintained could easily be disrupted. Back at the Jenkins farm, she found Martha sitting on her porch, watching the sunset with a thoughtful expression. "How are they?" Martha asked as Elena approached. "Thriving," Elena replied honestly. "They're part of the family now." Martha nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what that means. For them, for us. Everyone's got an opinion about what should happen next." "What do you think should happen?" Elena asked gently. Martha was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think nature figured out something we haven't. Maybe we should be humble enough to let it play out." But as the lights of another news van turned into the farm's long driveway, both women knew that the extraordinary adoption story had grown beyond their control. The peaceful existence of the unconventional family in the forest was about to face its greatest challenge: human intervention. The Pine Ridge Community Center hadn't been this crowded since the flood of 2018. Every folding chair was occupied, with additional residents standing along the walls, farmers and shop owners shoulder to shoulder, all drawn by the unusual story unfolding in their backyard. At the front of the room, a long table had been set up for the panel. Mayor Robert Hancock, County Commissioner Diane Lewis, Mark Hendricks, representing Wildlife Services, Dr. Patricia Lawson, and Elena, who shifted uncomfortably under the fluorescent lights. "Folks, let's bring this meeting to order," Mayor Hancock announced, tapping a gavel that seemed comically small in his large hand. A former high school football coach with a booming voice, he had a talent for commanding attention. "We're here to discuss the situation regarding the bobcat and domestic kittens on the Jenkins property." The mayor's diplomatic phrasing didn't last long. As soon as the floor opened for community input, The divisions became apparent. "This is a public safety issue," declared Samuel Wilson, whose property bordered the national forest. "Today it's kittens. Tomorrow it could be snatching children from backyards. Predators get bolder when they get comfortable around humans." A chorus of agreeing murmurs rose from one section of the room, while dismissive headshaking came from another. "That's ridiculous fear-mongering," countered Lisa Ortiz, who ran the local nature center. "Bobcats are shy, solitary animals that avoid human contact. This one hasn't shown any aggression toward people." Back and forth it went, with residents expressing everything from wonder to alarm, from scientific curiosity to superstitious fear. Some saw the adoption as a heartwarming miracle, others as an unnatural disruption of normal wildlife behavior that needed immediate correction. Elena watched Martha Jenkins, seated in the second row, her face tightening as her neighbors debated the fate of kittens born in her barn. When it was Martha's turn to speak, she stood with quiet dignity that immediately hushed the room. "These kittens were born on my property," she said simply. "Under normal circumstances, they'd be my responsibility. But these aren't normal circumstances. That mother bobcat has given those kittens a chance at life. A different life than we planned for them, but a life nonetheless. I've seen the pictures, seen how she cares for them. I think we should let her continue." The simplicity and sincerity of Martha's statement seemed to reset the tone of the meeting. Dr. Lawson took the opportunity to present the scientific perspective. "What we're witnessing is unprecedented," she explained, displaying some of Elena's photographs on a projector screen. "This isn't just a curiosity, it's an opportunity to understand interspecies dynamics that we've never documented before. The research value alone justifies a period of non-intervention and careful observation." County Commissioner Lewis frowned. "Research is all well and good, Doctor, but we have practical considerations. If word gets out about bobcats targeting pet cats, we'll have panicked residents and a PR nightmare. Some folks are already talking about hunting parties to protect their pets." At this, Mark Hendricks straightened. "I need to be absolutely clear. The bobcat and her kittens are protected under state wildlife regulations. Anyone harming them will face significant penalties." A tense murmur rippled through the room. Elena glanced at her watch. The meeting had been running for over an hour, and they seemed no closer to consensus. Then, from the back of the room, a new voice spoke up. "I might have some information that's relevant here." Heads turned to see Jacob Turner, an elderly man with the leathery skin of someone who had spent decades outdoors. Though well into his 70s, he still worked as a hunting guide in the mountains surrounding Pine Ridge. "The floor recognizes Jake Turner," Mayor Hancock said, gesturing for the man to continue. Jacob made his way slowly to the front of the room, every eye following him. He was a respected figure in the community, known for his extensive knowledge of local wildlife. "That bobcat with the notched ear? I've known about her for years," he said, his voice gravelly but clear. "She's distinctive. Been tracking her off and on since she was barely more than a kitten herself." Dr. Lawson leaned forward, suddenly intensely interested. "You have prior observations of this specific individual?" Jacob nodded. "About 3 years ago, that same bobcat was part of a research project by the university. They were radio collaring bobcats to study territory ranges. She was captured, collared, and released back into the wild." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "What's interesting is where they captured her, it wasn't in the forest. It was at a wildlife rehabilitation center about 60 miles from here." A buzz of conversation instantly filled the room. Elena exchanged a startled glance with Dr. Lawson. "Are you saying this bobcat was in captivity?" Elena asked. "For about 4 months," Jacob confirmed. "She'd been brought in as a young bobcat, injured and half-starved. The rehab center nursed her back to health." During that time, from what I understand, she was housed in a facility that also contained orphaned domestic kittens. The implications of this new information hit Elena like a physical force. The mother Bobcat's unusual behavior suddenly had context. She had been socialized around domestic cats during a formative period of her development. "That explains a lot, Doctor," Lawson said, almost to herself. "Imprinting and early socialization experiences can profoundly influence later behavior patterns, even in wild animals." Commissioner Lewis seized on this information from a different angle. "So this isn't some magical nature story after all. It's the result of human interference with a wild animal, which is now interfering with domestic animals as a consequence." "I wouldn't characterize rehabilitation as interference," Mark countered, his tone cooling noticeably. As the debate took this new direction, Elena found herself thinking about the Bobcat's journey, from injured youngster to rehabilitation to release, and now to her current role as the adoptive mother of an interspecies family. The story was even more remarkable than they had initially realized. Mayor Hancock, sensing the meeting could continue indefinitely without resolution, finally raised his hands for attention. "Here's what we're going to do," he announced with the decisive tone that had served him well during his 4 terms in office. "We'll establish a 30-day observation period. Dr. Lawson's team will continue their research, but with additional security measures to prevent unauthorized persons from disturbing the Bobcat family. Meanwhile, the county will work with wildlife services to develop contingency plans should any safety concerns arise." He looked around the room, his expression making it clear this was not a suggestion. "After 30 days, we'll reassess based on scientific findings and expert recommendations. Until then, I expect everyone to respect the protected status of these animals and the private property where they're located." The compromise seemed to satisfy most, though Elena noticed discontent on several faces. As the meeting adjourned, she found herself approached by Jacob Turner. "There's more to the story," he said quietly, "about that Bobcat's time in rehabilitation. Things that might explain why she's acting the way she is. If you're interested, come by my place tomorrow. I kept articles about the rehab center from back then." Before Elena could respond, Jacob was moving away through the dispersing crowd, leaving her with more questions than answers. She glanced across the room and caught Martha's eye. The older woman gave her a small nod as if to say she trusted Elena to find the right path forward for the unusual family that had formed in the shadow of their community. Outside the community center, television crews were already setting up for evening broadcasts, the unusual story continuing to draw media attention from across the region. As Elena slipped out a side door to avoid the cameras, she wondered how the mother Bobcat would react if she knew she had become the centerpiece of such human drama, or if, in her wild heart, she already sensed the growing storm surrounding her unconventional family. Jacob Turner's cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road about 3 miles outside of town, nestled against the foothills like it had grown there naturally, along with the ponderosa pines. Elena's truck bounced over the ruts and potholes, the suspension groaning in protest as she navigated the final approach. The place had the timeless quality of a homestead that had witnessed generations come and go, hand-hewn logs darkened by decades of weather, a stone chimney from which thin smoke curled against the morning sky, and a broad porch furnished with mismatched rocking chairs that had smoothed to a soft patina from years of use. Jacob himself was waiting on that porch, a mug of something steaming in his gnarled hands. He raised it in greeting as Elena parked and made her way up the worn path to the cabin. "Coffee?" he offered as she climbed the steps. "Or tea, if you prefer. Got some herbal stuff my granddaughter brings when she visits." "Coffee would be great," Elena said, taking in the view from the porch, a sweeping panorama of the valley below, the town of Pine Ridge visible as a cluster of buildings in the distance, surrounded by the vast expanse of forest. No wonder Jacob understood the local wildlife so well. From this vantage point, he could observe the entire ecosystem like a living tapestry. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly bright and orderly. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on natural history, wildlife biology, and local ecology. A large oak table dominated the main room, covered with maps, notebooks, and what appeared to be wildlife tracking journals. Jacob poured coffee from an ancient percolator into a chipped mug and handed it to Elena. "You've been documenting the local wildlife for some time," Elena observed, nodding toward the meticulously organized materials. Jacob settled into a chair with the comfortable movements of someone perfectly at home in their space. 63 years and counting. Started when I was 12, keeping track of deer movements for my father. Never stopped. He gestured toward a specific shelf. Third journal from the left, bound in green. That's from 2021-2022. Pages 42 through 47 should interest you. Elena retrieved the indicated journal and opened it carefully. Inside, she found Jacob's neat, precise handwriting, detailing wildlife sightings, weather conditions, and behavioral observations. On page 42, a newspaper clipping had been carefully attached with archival tape. The headline read, "Local Wildlife Center Celebrates Success with Rehabilitated Bobcat." The article, dated September 2021, described how a young female bobcat, approximately 8 months old, had been found severely injured near a highway, likely struck by a vehicle. The animal had been brought to the Mountain Valley Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, where it had undergone emergency surgery and months of intensive care. The accompanying photo showed a recovering bobcat with distinctive facial markings, unmistakably the same individual Elena had been observing. "That's her," Elena said, looking up at Jacob. "But what's this about domestic kittens?" Jacob nodded toward the journal. "Keep reading." Elena turned the page to find another clipping, this one from a smaller local paper. The article detailed an innovative rehabilitation technique being tested at Mountain Valley, where orphaned wildlife was sometimes housed with appropriate domestic counterparts to provide socialization and reduce stress. In one case study, a recovering bobcat kitten was successfully integrated with a group of orphaned domestic kittens, all of similar age. The theory was that the companionship would help them all thrive, Jacob explained. The staff was careful to ensure the bobcat also maintained appropriate wild behaviors for eventual release. Elena studied the grainy photo accompanying the article. It showed a young bobcat playing with what appeared to be 2 domestic kittens in a large enclosure designed to mimic a natural environment. So she was raised with domestic cats during a critical developmental period, Elena mused. That could explain her unusual behavior now. She might not view domestic cats as prey because she associates them with positive early experiences. "There's more," Jacob said quietly. "The rehabilitation center had an incident shortly before her release. Turn to page 46. The next clipping, dated February 2022, reported a break-in at the Mountain Valley facility. Several animals had been injured or released by the vandals, including the bobcat's domestic companions. The bobcat herself had been found hiding in her enclosure, apparently trying to protect the last surviving domestic kitten, which had been injured in the attack. Elena felt a chill as she read the details. She was trying to protect them even then. The center staff believed the trauma of that event actually delayed her readiness for release, Jacob confirmed. They kept her for additional rehabilitation, but noted her unusual protective behavior toward the remaining domestic kitten. Eventually, they had to separate them for the bobcat's final pre-release conditioning. Elena sat back, processing this new information. So her current behavior isn't just random. It has a history, a context. When she found Martha's kittens, something from her past might have triggered this protective response. "Nature and nurture intertwined," Jacob said with a nod. I've watched wildlife for most of my life, Dr. Ramirez. Animals aren't just instinct machines. They have experiences, memories, traumas, and bonds. Different from humans, sure, but real nonetheless. As Elena drove back toward town, her mind was racing with the implications of what she had learned. The bobcat's unusual behavior was still extraordinary, but now it had context, a history that made it comprehensible, if no less remarkable. She needed to share this information with Dr. Lawson and the research team. At the observation site, she found Dr. Lawson and 2 assistants carefully monitoring the bobcat family from the blind. The mother had just returned from a hunting expedition, carrying a rabbit for her mixed litter of kittens. She's teaching them to share food, Dr. Lawson noted as Elena settled in beside her. The domestic kittens are learning to eat raw meat alongside their bobcat siblings. It's fascinating adaptation on both sides. Elena shared what she had learned from Jacob and the journal clippings. Dr. Lawson listened intently, her expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "This changes our understanding of the situation significantly," she said when Elena had finished. "It's not just random adoption behavior. It's based on prior socialization and possibly trauma response. I need to update our research parameters." As they watched, the mother bobcat supervised the feeding, ensuring all 5 kittens got their share. Cole, the black kitten, seemed to have developed a particularly close bond with one of the bobcat kittens, the 2 of them often playing and hunting together. "Look at their movements," Dr. Lawson observed. "The domestic kittens are adopting bobcat behaviors, the stalking posture, the pounce technique, and the bobcats seem to be learning some domestic cat social behaviors in return. It's a remarkable cultural exchange." Elena realized that their scientific documentation of this unusual family had taken on new significance. It wasn't just an anomaly, it was a case study in how early experiences could reshape instinctive behaviors, how trauma could create unexpected bonds, and how adaptable these supposedly hardwired creatures could be. Back in town that evening, Elena faced a dilemma. The new information about the bobcat's history provided valuable context for understanding the situation, but she wasn't sure how it would affect the ongoing debate about intervention. Would people see this as more reason to let nature take its course, or as evidence that human influence had already contaminated the natural order? As she pulled up to the clinic to check on her patients, she noticed Martha Jenkins waiting by the door, her expression troubled. "There's something you need to know," Martha said without preamble. "Someone left a threatening note on my mailbox this morning. They're planning to solve the bobcat problem themselves if the authorities don't." The precarious peace that had been established at the town meeting was apparently more fragile than anyone had realized. The mother bobcat and her unusual family were now facing a new and more immediate threat: human fear translated into potential violence. Despite all the scientific observation and ethical debate, it seemed that the ultimate fate of this extraordinary adoption story might be decided not by careful consideration, but by whoever acted first and most decisively. Elena stared at the crumpled paper Martha had handed her, the crude message scrawled in heavy black marker. "Predators don't belong near homes. Problem solved this weekend." No signature, no specific details, but the intent was clear enough. "Have you shown this to Mark?" Elena asked, carefully folding the note and placing it in her pocket. Martha nodded. "He came by this morning, took photos, said he'd increase patrols around the property, but he can't post someone there 24/7. Elena's mind was already racing through options. "I'm going to call Dr. Lawson. We need to secure that observation site immediately." Within an hour, an emergency meeting had convened at Elena's clinic. Dr. Lawson, Mark Hendricks, Martha, and Jacob Turner, who had insisted on coming when Elena called him about the threat. "This isn't just about protecting wildlife anymore," Mark said grimly, staring at the threatening note now sealed in an evidence bag on Elena's desk. This is a criminal investigation. Threatening to harm protected wildlife is a federal offense. The problem is enforcement, Dr. Lawson pointed out. We can't maintain surveillance on that den site indefinitely, and even with your patrols, Mark, there are too many ways to access that area from the National Forest side. Jacob cleared his throat. I might have a solution. Been thinking about this since Elena came to see me. What if we relocated the entire family? 4 pairs of eyes turned to him in surprise. Relocate them where? Elena asked. The old Carson property, Jacob said. 2,000 acres of private land adjacent to the National Forest on the north side. Been unoccupied since old man Carson died last year. His daughter inherited it, but she lives in Seattle, has no interest in the place except keeping it from developers. He looked at Martha. It's perfect habitat, similar to where they are now, but with natural boundaries that make it easier to secure. And I happen to know Marion Carson would be amenable to using her land for wildlife conservation. We've corresponded about it. Dr. Lawson frowned. Relocating a wild bobcat family is extremely risky. The mother could abandon the kittens if she's stressed, or they could all flee in different directions during transport, not to mention the trauma of capture. It's risky, Jacob acknowledged, but less risky than waiting for someone with a rifle to take matters into their own hands. The group debated options for nearly an hour, weighing the risks of intervention against the growing threat of human interference. Finally, Dr. Lawson sighed. I need to consult with my colleagues at the department, but Jacob's suggestion might be our best option. If we can secure permission quickly, we could perform the relocation as early as tomorrow. As the meeting broke up, Elena found herself standing with Martha on the clinic's front porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. This wasn't what I expected when I called you about a missing kitten, Martha said quietly. Elena smiled despite the tension. Me neither, but those kittens have shown us something extraordinary, haven't they? Something most people never get to see. Martha nodded, her weathered face thoughtful. Life finds a way, doesn't it? Not always the way we expect or plan, but it finds a way. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect conditions for the relocation operation. Dr. Lawson had secured emergency approval from the State Wildlife Department, and Marion Carson had enthusiastically given permission to use her property after Jacob reached out to her. A team of wildlife specialists had arrived before dawn, bringing specialized transport equipment designed to minimize stress to the animals. Elena arrived at Martha's farm to find a small convoy of vehicles, official Wildlife Department trucks, Mark's patrol SUV, and Jacob's ancient but reliable Land Rover. Dr. Lawson was briefing the team on the plan. We'll approach from multiple angles to prevent escape routes, she explained, pointing to a topographical map spread across the hood of a truck. Tranquilizer darts for the mother only if absolutely necessary. We want to try to capture the entire family with minimal chemical intervention if possible. Elena, who had volunteered her veterinary expertise for the operation, listened carefully to the protocols. They would use large transport carriers with dividers that could be removed once the animals were secure, allowing the family to remain together during relocation. The plan was well thought out, but everyone understood the risks. Wildlife relocation was never guaranteed to succeed. As they prepared to depart for the den site, a familiar sound made them all look up, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors. A news chopper appeared over the tree line, circling low enough to make conversation difficult. "Are you kidding me?" Mark shouted over the noise. "How did they find out about this?" No one had an answer, but the implications were immediately clear. If news crews had learned about the operation, others might have as well, including whoever had left the threatening note. "We need to move now," Dr. Lawson decided, gesturing for the team to load up. "That helicopter is going to stress the animals and complicate everything." The procession of vehicles headed toward the forest access road, the helicopter maintaining an infuriating presence overhead. Elena rode with Jacob in his Land Rover, which handled the rough terrain with practiced ease. "Something's not right," Jacob muttered as they bounced along a particularly rutted section. "That's not just a news chopper. Look at the markings." Elena squinted upward. The helicopter did have a camera mounted on its side, but it lacked the clear station identification normally displayed on news aircraft. "Could be a freelancer," she suggested. "Or someone who chartered a helicopter to get footage they can sell." Jacob's expression remained troubled. "Maybe. Or someone who wants to find that den site for other reasons." His concern proved prophetic. As they approached the final stretch of road before they would need to continue on foot, Mark's patrol SUV in the lead suddenly braked hard. The convoy halted and Elena saw Mark step out, hand on his sidearm, approaching a pickup truck parked sideways across the access road. 3 men stood beside the truck, 2 with rifles clearly visible. Even from a distance, Elena recognized one of them, Samuel Wilson, the property owner who had spoken so forcefully at the town meeting about the threat posed by the Bobcat. "This isn't going to end well," Jacob muttered, reaching beneath his seat and pulling out a shotgun of his own. At Elena's startled look, he shrugged. "Been dealing with wilderness my whole life, Doc. Sometimes you need more than words." The confrontation ahead was tense but brief. Mark's authoritative presence, backed by the official Wildlife Department vehicles and personnel, seemed to deflate the men's bravado. After a few minutes of animated conversation, they reluctantly moved their truck, allowing the convoy to pass. "They won't be the last," Jacob predicted grimly as they continued toward the den site. "Word travels fast in small towns." When they finally reached the point where they would need to proceed on foot, Dr. Lawson gathered the team for final instructions. The helicopter had finally departed, perhaps running low on fuel, which gave them a small window of opportunity. "We approach quietly, deploy the capture nets as practiced, and secure all animals as quickly and calmly as possible," she reminded everyone. "Remember, our priority is keeping the family unit together through this process." The team moved through the forest with practiced stealth, carrying the specialized equipment that would allow them to safely capture and transport the Bobcat family. Elena found herself holding her breath as they approached the rocky outcropping that concealed the den. She had been here several times now to observe, but today's mission was entirely different. As they took up their positions surrounding the den site, Dr. Lawson gave the signal to begin. Specialized barriers were quietly erected to channel the animals toward the waiting capture devices. Everything was in place. But when they finally moved in to secure the den, they made a devastating discovery. The den was empty. No mother bobcat, no kittens, domestic or wild. The entire family had vanished. The only evidence of their recent presence was a small patch of disturbed earth near the den entrance, a set of unfamiliar human boot prints, and something that made Elena's blood run cold, a small tuft of black fur caught on a jagged rock with what appeared to be a spot of dried blood. Someone had reached the Bobcat family before they did. The mood at the empty den site shifted instantly from cautious optimism to grim determination. Mark Hendricks immediately radioed for additional law enforcement support, while Dr. Lawson's team began a methodical examination of the area for evidence. "These boot prints are fresh," Jacob observed, crouching to study the impressions in the soft earth. "Less than 12 hours old, size 11 or 12, deep tread pattern, probably hunting boots." Elena carefully collected the tuft of black fur with tweezers, placing it in a small evidence bag. "This could be from Cole," she said quietly. "I'll need to examine it more closely to confirm." "Doctor." Lawson was studying disturbed ground at the den entrance. "There are drag marks here," she pointed out. "Something, or someone, was pulled from the den." The wildlife team expanded their search in concentric circles around the den site, looking for any sign of where the Bobcat family might have gone or been taken. Elena found herself partnered with Jacob, the older man moving through the forest with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime reading its signs. "There," he said after about 20 minutes, pointing to a barely visible disturbance in the pine needle carpet. "Something passed through here recently, several somethings." Elena might have missed it entirely without Jacob's guidance, but once he pointed it out, she could see the subtle trail, broken twigs, displaced leaves, and the occasional partial footprint. They followed it carefully, marking their path with biodegradable tape for the others to follow. The trail led downhill toward a small stream, where they lost it briefly before Jacob spotted signs of passage on the opposite bank. "Clever," he muttered, using the water to break the trail. They were about half a mile from the original den site when Jacob suddenly raised his hand, signaling Elena to stop. He pointed silently to a splash of color ahead that seemed out of place in the forest palette, a vivid blue that didn't belong among the greens and browns of the woodlands. Moving forward with exaggerated care, they found a small clearing where the evidence of human presence was unmistakable: a crushed energy drink can, cigarette butts, and the distinctive rectangular impression of a trap or cage that had been placed on the ground. "Someone set a trap here," Jacob said grimly, examining the site without touching anything. "Professional grade, based on the dimensions, and they caught something." He pointed to tracks in a patch of bare earth, the distinctive prints of a bobcat, overlaid with human boot prints. Elena's heart sank. "Do you think they caught all of them?" Jacob's weathered face was impossible to read. "Hard to say. 5 animals would have required multiple traps or a very large transport cage." He studied the ground carefully. "There are scattered small prints here, probably the kittens. They seem to head in that direction." He pointed toward a dense thicket about 20 yards away. Before they could investigate further, the crackle of a radio announced the arrival of Mark and 2 additional officers, followed shortly by Dr. Lawson. "Found evidence of trapping," Jacob reported, pointing out what they had discovered. "Professional equipment, probably baited to lure them in." Mark's expression darkened as he surveyed the scene. "This is a coordinated wildlife crime now. I'm calling in the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service." While the officers secured the area as a crime scene, Elena and Jacob continued following the faint trail of small prints toward the thicket. As they approached, a sudden rustling sound made them freeze. Jacob raised his hand again for silence, then slowly, deliberately, made a soft chirping sound that Elena had heard the mother bobcat use to call her kittens. After a moment of breathless waiting, an answering sound emerged from the dense underbrush, not a perfect mimicry, but close enough to make Elena's pulse quicken. She exchanged a glance with Jacob, who nodded encouragingly. Elena crouched down and made the same gentle chirping sound. This time the response was immediate. A small black shape darted from beneath a fallen log, moving with desperate speed toward Elena. Cole, the black kitten, his fur matted and dirty but unmistakably alive, launched himself into Elena's arms with such force that she nearly lost her balance. "He's alive," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it as the kitten clung to her, trembling violently. Cole's claws dug into her jacket as if he feared being torn away again. Elena quickly examined him for injuries, finding scratches and what appeared to be a graze wound along one flank, but nothing life-threatening. Jacob was already searching the thicket. "Here," he called softly after a few moments. Curled beneath the hollow formed by exposed tree roots, they found the gray kitten Ash along with one of the bobcat kittens. Both were frightened but apparently unharmed. They scattered when the trapper took the mother, Jacob surmised. Probably fled in panic. Elena cradled Cole while Jacob gently extracted the other 2 kittens. "We're missing one bobcat kitten," she noted, anxiety creeping into her voice despite the relief of finding 3 of the 5 family members. A thorough search of the surrounding area yielded no sign of the missing kitten or the mother bobcat. The wildlife officers had begun processing the trap site, collecting evidence including cigarette butts for DNA testing and taking casts of the boot prints. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," Mark said as they regrouped. "This wasn't just some angry local taking matters into their own hands. The method suggests someone with experience capturing live wildlife." Dr. Lawson was examining the 3 recovered kittens, which had been placed together in a secure carrier. "They're stressed but in relatively good condition," she reported. "The domestic kittens especially seem to have bonded with each other for security. The bobcat kitten is more agitated, probably missing its mother more acutely." As the search expanded across the forest, a disturbing theory began to take shape. "There's a black market for exotic animals," Dr. Lawson explained as they waited for additional search teams to arrive. "A live bobcat could be worth thousands to the right buyer. Some private collectors will pay premium prices for unusual specimens. A bobcat known to adopt domestic cats might be particularly valuable. Or someone could be planning to use her for breeding," Elena suggested, remembering stories she'd heard about backyard operations that crossed wild cats with domestic ones to create exotic-looking pets. By late afternoon, the search had expanded to cover several square miles without any further sign of the mother bobcat or the missing kitten. Federal wildlife agents had arrived, bringing additional resources including tracking dogs, but the scent trail had gone cold at a fire road about a mile from the trap site. "They had a vehicle waiting," Mark concluded, loaded the trapped animals and drove away. As darkness approached, difficult decisions had to be made. The 3 recovered kittens needed proper care after their ordeal, and continuing the search at night would be dangerous and likely unproductive. "We'll take them to my clinic for now," Elena offered. "They know me, at least somewhat, and I have the facilities to care for them overnight." Back at the veterinary clinic, Elena settled the 3 kittens in a quiet room, equipped with comfortable bedding, food, water, and climbing structures. Cole and Ash stayed close to their bobcat sibling, the 3 of them huddled together in a protective knot of fur. The domestic kittens seemed to be providing comfort to the wild one, licking its ears and pressing against it as if trying to substitute for its missing mother and litter mate. As Elena watched them through the observation window, Martha Jenkins arrived, her face lined with worry. "I came as soon as I heard," she said. "Any word on the mother?" Elena shook her head. "Nothing yet. The federal agents have put out alerts to all wildlife enforcement offices in the region. They're checking surveillance cameras on all roads leading out of the national forest." Martha studied the 3 kittens, now sleeping in an exhausted pile. What will happen to them now? It was the question Elena had been avoiding. Without the mother bobcat, the future of this unusual blended family had become far more complicated. The bobcat kitten would need specialized rehabilitation if it was ever to return to the wild. The domestic kittens could be readopted, but after their experiences, they would hardly be typical house cats. "I don't know," Elena admitted, "but I'm not giving up on finding their mother. Someone in this community knows something, and I intend to find out what it is." As if in response to her determination, Cole opened his eyes briefly, meeting Elena's gaze through the glass with a steady, trusting look that made her resolve harden. The story of the bobcat who had kidnapped kittens to save them wasn't over yet, not if she had anything to say about it. Word of the missing bobcat and the recovery of 3 kittens spread through Pine Ridge with the explosive speed that only small-town gossip networks can achieve. By morning, Elena's clinic phone was ringing constantly. Concerned citizens, amateur sleuths offering theories, reporters seeking statements, and even a few callers with information that seemed potentially useful. The blue pickup again, Elena said, jotting notes as she balanced the phone between her ear and shoulder. That's the third person who's mentioned seeing an unfamiliar blue pickup truck in the area yesterday morning. She thanked the caller and hung up, turning to Jacob and Mark, who were reviewing a map of the region spread across her office desk. Could be something, Mark acknowledged. I've already got officers checking traffic cameras on all the major roads out of the county. If this vehicle passed any of them, we might get a plate number. The three recovered kittens had spent a relatively calm night at the clinic. Elena had been surprised and moved to find that Cole, the black kitten, had taken on a protective role toward the Bobcat kitten, grooming it, coaxing it to eat, and staying pressed against its side as if providing surrogate parental comfort. The resilience of these young animals in the face of trauma was remarkable. Dr. Lawson had arrived early with 2 specialized wildlife rehabilitators to assess the Bobcat kitten's condition and needs. He's maintaining normal behaviors, which is a good sign, she reported, but he's definitely missing his mother and sibling. We need to find them quickly. The federal agents had expanded their investigation, focusing on known wildlife traffickers in the region. There's an established black market for exotic pets, Agent Rivera explained during their morning briefing. A live adult bobcat could sell for anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000, depending on the buyer. If word got out about this one's unusual behavior with domestic cats, that could drive the price even higher. By mid-morning, Elena found herself drafted into a coordinated search effort. Dozens of volunteers from town had showed up, organized into teams by Mark and the federal agents. Jacob had become an unofficial consultant, his decades of tracking experience suddenly invaluable. We'll grid search these areas, Mark announced, pointing to sections of the forest map. Remember, we're looking for any sign of recent human activity, tire tracks, discarded items, disturbed ground. Do not approach if you find something suspicious. Mark the location and radio immediately. Elena was paired with Lisa Ortiz from the Nature Center, who had brought specialized gear, including thermal imaging equipment borrowed from a research project. It won't detect the Bobcat directly at this point, Lisa explained as they headed out to their assigned sector, but it might help us identify places where a vehicle has recently been parked off-road. The engine heat leaves a signature on the ground that can last for hours. As they hiked through their section of forest, Elena found herself sharing the story of the Bobcat's unusual history, her time in rehabilitation, the trauma she had experienced, and the remarkable bond she had formed with the domestic kittens. That explains so much, Lisa said thoughtfully. Animals aren't the simple creatures we often assume them to be. They have complex emotional lives, memories, traumas, not unlike humans in some ways. They had been searching for about 2 hours when Lisa's thermal scanner picked up an anomaly, a fading heat signature near a rarely used Forest Service road. Following the reading, they discovered an area where a vehicle had recently been parked, the vegetation crushed and tire impressions still visible in the soft shoulder. Someone pulled off here within the last 24 hours, Lisa observed, carefully photographing the tire tracks without disturbing them. Elena used the radio to report their finding, and within minutes, Mark and a federal agent arrived to secure the area. Good work, Mark said, examining the site. These match the tire pattern we found near the trap location. Looks like they used this as a loading point, remote enough to avoid being seen, but accessible by vehicle. Elena scrutinized the surrounding forest. Something about the location nagged at her. It seemed oddly familiar, though she couldn't immediately place why. Then it hit her. This road leads to the old Garrison property, she said suddenly. The abandoned hunting lodge about 3 miles up. Mark immediately recognized the significance. Isolated, secure building with road access, but completely out of sight. Perfect place to temporarily hold animals before transport. Within 30 minutes, a tactical team had assembled. The Garrison property had been vacant for years after the owner died without heirs, the estate tangled in legal disputes. The hunting lodge itself was a sturdy stone and timber structure set back from the road, designed to withstand harsh mountain winters. Elena had been instructed to remain with the vehicles while the law enforcement team approached the lodge, but that plan dissolved when one of the officers reported back urgently. "We've got cages inside, signs of recent occupation, and Dr. Ramirez might want to see this. There's some kind of veterinary equipment set up." With professional curiosity overriding caution, Elena followed Mark up to the lodge, entering through the heavy front door that had been forced open by the tactical team. The interior was dusty and dim, but showed clear signs of recent use: food wrappers, battery-powered lanterns, and most tellingly, a large metal transport cage in what had once been the main living area. "This is a professional wildlife transport unit," Elena observed, examining the cage without touching it. "The kind zoos use for moving large cats." She pointed to a small tuft of fur caught in the cage door. Bobcat fur. In what had once been the kitchen, they found a makeshift veterinary station, a folding table with a scatter of supplies including syringes, vials of what appeared to be sedatives, and a portable ultrasound machine. They were examining her here, Elena realized, an icy feeling settling in her stomach. Checking to see if she was pregnant, probably. A pregnant bobcat would be even more valuable to a breeder. But there was no sign of the mother bobcat or the missing kitten themselves. Whatever had happened here, the animals had already been moved elsewhere. As the team continued to process the scene for evidence, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Martha. "Samuel Wilson selling his property, moving somewhere warmer, according to Realtor. Left this morning." Elena showed the message to Mark, whose expression darkened. Wilson was one of the most vocal opponents at the town meeting, and he was part of the group that tried to block our access to the den site. A quick call to the local real estate office confirmed that Wilson had indeed listed his 80-acre property for sale that morning, with instructions to handle everything remotely as he would be traveling extensively. "We need to get to Wilson's place now," Mark said, already moving toward the door. "He might still have the animals there, or evidence of where they've been taken." The convoy of law enforcement vehicles made record time to Wilson's property, a sprawling farmhouse set back from the main road by a long gravel driveway. As they pulled up, Elena immediately noticed the absence of vehicles. The property appeared deserted. Federal agents secured the perimeter while Mark obtained an emergency warrant by phone, allowing them to enter the premises to search for the endangered animals. Elena followed the first team into the large barn behind the house, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The barn was mostly empty, but at the far end stood a large covered object. When an agent pulled away the heavy tarp, Elena gasped. Beneath it was a custom-built transport container with air holes and specialized security features, exactly the kind of equipment used for shipping exotic animals long distances. And it was empty, with the door standing open. A shipping label had been partially removed, but enough remained visible to make out an international destination code and part of an address. "They're gone," Mark said quietly, examining the container. This was prepped for transport to somewhere outside the U.S. Elena felt a wave of despair washing over her. They had been so close, only to discover they were already too late. As she turned away from the empty container, her gaze fell on a crumpled receipt that had been swept into a corner of the barn. Picking it up carefully, she smoothed it out to reveal a vehicle rental agreement from a company in the next county over. The vehicle description made her breath catch. A blue pickup truck rented 3 days ago to a name that wasn't Samuel Wilson, but one Elena recognized immediately. The pieces suddenly locked into place, revealing the true orchestrator of the Bobcat's disappearance and possibly a last chance to find her before she vanished forever. "Dr. Kenneth Walsh," Elna said, staring at the name on the receipt. He's a veterinarian from Riverdale, about 50 miles south of here. Specializes in exotic animals. Mark frowned. You know him? Not personally, but by reputation. He's presented at veterinary conferences I've attended. Elena's mind was racing, connecting dots she hadn't previously seen. He's respected in certain circles, but there have always been rumors about his side businesses, breeding exotic hybrids, consulting for private collectors with questionable permits. The revelation sent the investigation into overdrive. Within minutes, federal agents were running background checks and obtaining Walsh's address and known properties. His main veterinary practice in Riverdale was legitimate, but he also owned a remote cabin near Blackwater Lake, about 30 miles away. The cabin is our most likely target, Agent Rivera decided. Isolated, accessible by road but private. If he's holding animals for transport, that's where they'll be. As law enforcement mobilized for a raid on the cabin, Elena faced a difficult decision. Protocol dictated that she stay behind. This was now a federal operation involving armed suspects potentially engaged in international wildlife trafficking. But she also knew she was uniquely positioned to help the Bobcat if they found her. I need to be there, she insisted to Mark. If that Bobcat is sedated or injured, minutes could make the difference, and she knows me, at least somewhat. After a brief consultation with the federal agents, a compromise was reached. Elena could accompany the second wave once the property was secured. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being left behind entirely. The agonizing wait at the staging area seemed endless. Elena checked and rechecked her emergency veterinary kit, preparing for any contingency. Jacob had insisted on coming as well, his knowledge of bobcat behavior potentially valuable once the animals were located. Something doesn't add up, Jacob mused as they waited. Walsh is a professional. Why risk his reputation and freedom for one bobcat, even an unusual one? Elena had been wondering the same thing. Maybe the story about her adopting domestic kittens made her particularly valuable to certain collectors. Or, she paused, a new and disturbing thought forming. What if this isn't about selling her? What if it's about studying her? Before Jacob could respond, the radio crackled with the news they'd been waiting for. The cabin was secured. 2 suspects were in custody, including Walsh himself. Animals were present on the property. Condition unknown. The drive to the cabin was tense. Elena's hands gripping her kit so tightly, her knuckles whitened. As they pulled up to the property, a surprisingly modern structure of glass and wood overlooking the lake, she saw Walsh sitting in the back of a police vehicle, his expression oddly calm despite the circumstances. Agent Rivera met them at the door. "You're going to want to see this," she said grimly, leading them through the cabin to what appeared to be a purpose-built addition at the rear, a climate-controlled room equipped with scientific equipment and monitoring devices. In the center stood a large habitat enclosure, and inside, looking remarkably unperturbed, was the mother bobcat. Beside her, in a smaller connected enclosure, was the missing bobcat kitten. Both appeared physically unharmed, though the mother was wearing what looked like a modified research collar. "They're alive," Elena breathed, relief washing over her. "And apparently quite comfortable," Agent Rivera noted with a frown. "This isn't a temporary holding facility, it's a research environment." Elena approached the enclosure carefully, studying the bobcat through the heavy mesh. The cat watched her with alert yellow eyes, showing no signs of distress. When Elena made the gentle chirping sound she'd learned, the bobcat's ears perked forward with recognition. "She remembers me," Elena murmured, "or at least she recognizes the sound." A federal veterinarian had already examined the enclosure and monitoring equipment. "They've been implanted with tracking microchips and biometric sensors," he reported. "Sophisticated stuff. Measures heart rate, temperature, stress hormones. The mother's collar records vocalizations and has a camera." "They were studying her," Elena realized, the pieces finally clicking into place. Not selling her. Agent Rivera nodded toward a computer setup in the corner. We've secured their research files. Preliminary review suggests this was part of an unauthorized behavioral study, specifically focused on cross-species adoption behaviors. As Elena digested this information, Mark appeared at the door with a troubled expression. "You need to see who the other suspect is," he said quietly. Outside, seated in a separate patrol car, was a face Elena recognized immediately. Dr. Patricia Lawson, the state wildlife biologist who had been leading the official research project on the Bobcat family. She was working with Walsh? Elena asked, disbelief coloring her voice. Mark nodded grimly. According to their initial statements, they've been collaborating for months. The whole thing. The observation, the documentation, even the town meeting. It was all part of their research methodology. They were studying not just the bobcat's behavior, but the community's response to an unusual wildlife situation. The betrayal stung sharply. Elena had trusted Lawson, shared findings with her, worked alongside her to protect the Bobcat family. Finding out she had been manipulating the situation all along felt like a physical blow. When allowed to briefly speak with Lawson, Elena struggled to maintain her professional composure. "Why?" she demanded. "Why not conduct this research legally, through proper channels?" Lawson's expression remained frustratingly academic, as if she were discussing a theoretical case rather than her own actions. The official channels would have never approved the full scope of what we needed to study. The integration of wildlife and human communities is the frontier of conservation biology, but the old guard is too hidebound to see it. She leaned forward intently. That bobcat represents a breakthrough, Elena. She demonstrates behavioral plasticity that challenges our fundamental understanding of wildlife. So you orchestrated her capture, traumatized those kittens, manipulated an entire community. We preserved the family unit, Lawson countered defensively. They were never in danger. The plan was always to reunite them once we had the baseline data we needed. The explanations rang hollow against the reality of what Elena had witnessed. The terrified kittens hiding in the forest, the community thrown into conflict, the resources wasted on searching for animals that had been taken by the very people leading the search. As Lawson was led away, Jacob joined Elena, his weathered face somber. "Scientists sometimes forget that knowledge without ethics is a dangerous thing," he said quietly. The immediate challenge now was determining what to do with the recovered bobcat and her kitten. The federal authorities would need to keep them as evidence temporarily, but eventually, decisions would need to be made about their future. They should be reunited with the others, Elena insisted during the debriefing session. The family bond is real regardless of how it was studied or manipulated. Breaking it permanently would cause unnecessary trauma. After much discussion, a temporary solution emerged. The mother bobcat and her wild kitten would be transferred to a secure wildlife holding facility where Elena could bring the 3 recovered kittens for a supervised reunion. The long-term plan would depend on expert evaluations and legal considerations once the case against Walsh and Lawson proceeded. That evening, as Elena checked on Cole, Ash, and their bobcat sibling at her clinic, she found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had begun with a simple call about a missing kitten. The black kitten had been kidnapped by a bobcat. That much of the sensational story was true. But the greater kidnapping had been perpetrated by humans who should have known better, who had used the animals as unwitting subjects in their quest for knowledge. Cole approached the observation window, pressing a small black paw against the glass as if sensing Elena's presence. His green eyes, once so frightened, now held a steady confidence despite all he had endured. Tomorrow, he would be reunited with his unusual adoptive mother, a reunion that Elena hoped would begin healing the trauma that human interference had caused. The truth behind the Bobcat kidnapper had indeed been shocking, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. And the final chapter of this extraordinary story was yet to be written. 6 months after the dramatic events that had captivated Pine Ridge and briefly thrust the small town into national headlines, Elena stood at the observation window of a specialized habitat enclosure at the Mountain Valley Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Inside, Cole was engaged in what appeared to be a game of hide-and-seek with his bobcat siblings, his black fur a stark contrast to their tawny spotted coats, as they stalked and pounced among artificial rock formations and specially designed enrichment structures. The reunion of the unusual family had been a moment Elena would never forget. When the mother bobcat had first been brought into the same enclosure as the 3 recovered kittens, there had been a moment of tense uncertainty. Would she still recognize them after the separation? Would the bond remain intact? Cole had been the first to approach, moving with cautious determination toward the larger predator. The mother bobcat had gone completely still, her yellow eyes fixed on the small black shape advancing toward her. Then, in a movement so swift it was almost imperceptible, she had closed the distance and begun methodically grooming the black kitten, who melted against her with a visible relief that had brought tears to Elena's eyes. One by one, the other kittens had approached and been welcomed back into the family unit. Within hours, it was as if they had never been separated, the 5 animals once again a coherent, if unconventional family. "They're doing exceptionally well," said Dr. Mira Santos, the new lead biologist overseeing what had now become an official, ethically approved research project. Cole, in particular, has developed some fascinating hybrid behaviors, a blend of domestic cat social skills with bobcat hunting techniques. The case against Dr. Walsh and Dr. Lawson had proceeded swiftly, resulting in federal charges for wildlife trafficking, unauthorized research on protected species, and evidence tampering. Walsh had accepted a plea deal, providing extensive testimony about similar operations across the country. Lawson had maintained her defense that she was acting in the interest of scientific advancement, but the courts had been unimpressed by her justifications for breaking wildlife protection laws. The scandal had rocked the wildlife research community, prompting a comprehensive review of ethical guidelines and oversight mechanisms. Several prestigious journals had retracted papers authored by Walsh and Lawson when it became clear that their data had been obtained through questionable means. For Elena, the case had opened unexpected doors. Her expertise and ethical stance throughout the ordeal had earned her a consulting position with the Federal Wildlife Agency, advising on cases involving veterinary aspects of wildlife trafficking. She still maintained her small-town practice, but now traveled frequently to share her experience with law enforcement and wildlife officials. Martha Jenkins had become something of a local celebrity. Her straightforward compassion and wisdom featured in several national magazine profiles. She'd leveraged her sudden platform to advocate for rural wildlife conservation, establishing a small foundation that helped property owners create wildlife-friendly environments. "We're considering a limited release program," Dr. Santos continued, walking with Elena around the perimeter of the large habitat. "Not full rewilding, but a controlled semi-wild environment where they can live more naturally while still being monitored." The plan, as Dr. Santos explained it, involved moving the family to a 20-acre enclosed sanctuary being developed specifically for their unique situation. There, the bobcat and her mixed offspring could roam more freely, hunt natural prey, and develop more wild behaviors while still receiving supplemental care and observation. "And the domestic kittens?" Elena asked, watching as Ash playfully batted at his bobcat sibling's tail. "That's where it gets interesting," Dr. Santos smiled. "Cole and Ash have developed such strong wild-type behaviors that our assessments suggest they might actually thrive in the sanctuary environment, They hunt cooperatively with their bobcat siblings, respond to their mother's vocalizations, and demonstrate appropriate caution toward humans. The observation didn't entirely surprise Elena. She had witnessed firsthand how adaptable the domestic kittens had been, learning from their wild family members while still retaining their unique personalities. Cole, especially, seemed to exist comfortably between worlds, capable of accepting gentle handling from his human caretakers, but equally at home practicing stalking techniques alongside his bobcat siblings. "We're calling it reverse domestication," Dr. Santos continued. "It challenges our understanding of the boundaries between wild and domestic animals. These kittens are teaching us that those categories might be more fluid than we previously thought." As they completed their tour, Elena paused at one final observation window. The mother bobcat was sprawled on a sun-warmed rock. All 4 kittens, 2 wild, 2 domestic, piled around and on top of her in various positions of feline repose. Despite their different origins, they had formed a cohesive family unit, bound by genuine attachment and shared experience. "Jacob would have loved to see this," Elena said softly. The old tracker had passed away peacefully in his sleep just 2 months earlier, leaving behind decades of meticulous wildlife journals that had proven invaluable to researchers. His property had been donated to a conservation trust, ensuring it would remain undeveloped wilderness in perpetuity. His contribution to this case was immeasurable, Dr. Santos agreed. "We've named the new sanctuary after him, Turner Wildlife Sanctuary." Outside the rehabilitation center, Pine Ridge was settling back into its normal rhythms after the excitement of the previous year. The media attention had eventually faded, though occasionally documentary crews still visited to film updates on the unusual bobcat family for nature programs. The town had found a graceful way to incorporate the story into its identity without exploiting it, adding a small bobcat-themed playground to the town park and hosting an annual wildlife appreciation festival. Samuel Wilson, who had fled rather than face questioning about his role in the wildlife trafficking operation, had been apprehended trying to cross the Canadian border. His cooperation with authorities had implicated several other participants in the scheme, leading to the disruption of a significant wildlife trafficking network. As Elena drove back to her clinic, she reflected on how a single unexpected event, a bobcat taking in domestic kittens, had rippled outward to affect so many lives. The boundaries she had once believed were fixed, between wild and domestic, between animal and human communities, now seemed more permeable, more complex. That evening, she received a special delivery at the clinic, an advance copy of a children's book written by Maggie Chen, the local bookstore owner. Titled Cole and the Bobcat, it told a simplified version of the true story, beautifully illustrated and crafted to teach children about wildlife conservation and unexpected friendships. Elena smiled as she turned the pages, recognizing the care Maggie had taken to be scientifically accurate while still capturing the wonder of the unusual adoption. 1 year to the day after Cole had first disappeared from Martha's barn, Elena joined a small group of officials and local residents at the newly completed Turner Wildlife Sanctuary for a private opening ceremony. As the gates were opened to admit the transport vehicle containing the bobcat family to their new home, Elena felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but the beginning of a new chapter. From the original crisis had emerged new understanding, new research, new protections for wildlife, and a community forever changed by its brush with an extraordinary animal family. The mother bobcat had kidnapped kittens, not out of aggression or predatory instinct, but out of a capacity for nurturing that transcended the boundaries humans had tried to impose on her nature. And in doing so, she had taught them all that the wild heart is more complex, more adaptable, and more capable of connection than anyone had imagined, a lesson worth every moment of the journey it had taken to learn it.